Thank you very much for joining us today. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Daniel Jolis, coming to you from the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics. I'm a researcher here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm proud to be producing research for our Generations Hub, which is all about how we can get employees of different generations working better together. We're currently partnering with organisations for our global annual survey. I'm going to be talking more about those in a minute. We're going to be undertaking that shortly. Please do get in touch today if you want to participate and work with us. It's going to be amazing. Our next focus is going to be on artificial intelligence and generations. But for today's panel, I've chosen today's title, Moving from Multi-Generational to Intergenerational Workplaces, based on some of the research that we've found in our first two reports. We've produced these reports with generous sponsorship from Productivity, and the reports are Generations, Unlocking the Potential of a Multi-Generational Workforce, and When Generations Meet, the Productivity Potential of Multi-Generational Meetings. Now, if any of you haven't read those reports and you'd like to, the links will be included in today's chat. Importantly, what both these reports show is that while we have multi-generational representation in our organizations, that is, we have people of different ages and generations, these generations are not always working together effectively to achieve the productivity potential that the generational diversity brings. So there's a big question: how do we get different generations in our teams collaborating in a way that maximizes productivity? How do we make our workforces truly intergenerational rather than simply having this multi-generational representation? I have three fabulous guests here with me today, and they're going to help me answer just that. Just before I introduce them, I'm just going to cover a little bit of housekeeping. For anyone, it's the first time joining an Inclusion Initiative panel, again, a big welcome. If you want to use your Q&A button in Zoom just to ask us any questions, we will make some time at the end for questions, so please don't hesitate to put them in. And please also note that the event is being recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I want to start with Alicia. Alicia Bruce, we have with us today. Alicia is a consultant at Oliver Wyman and a politics and economics graduate from the London School of Economics. During her time here at the LSE, Alicia was president of the LSE Advancing Black Careers Society. Now, Alicia's had a distinguished academic career here at the LSE. She was awarded the Ugler Family Scholarship for her studies, and during her time here, she received several notable awards, including the Upreach Social Mobility Award, the Bright Network Breaking Barriers Award, Top 150 Future Leaders, and she was also an Undergraduate of the Year. Alicia's also made national media headlines. She presented to Queen Elizabeth on her Diamond Jubilee. Her YouTube channel has also made the news, and she has a terrific new podcast called To My Younger Self, which I'm excited to talk more about today. Welcome, Alicia. Next, I'd like to introduce Emily Abbott. Emily is the program director at Intergenerational Music Making and a co-founder of Intergenerational England. Emily's work is all about driving social change and promoting health and well-being through intergenerational approaches. She's been especially successful, I've seen, in building partnerships across the housing, care, health, education, and of course, workforce sectors here in the UK. She's co-created national award-winning initiatives such as Together with Music and Talking Generations. Now, I know Emily through Intergenerational England, which is currently leading an all-party parliamentary group on tackling loneliness and connected communities, but also, and what I think is especially relevant for the people who are here today, is that Emily and the team at Intergenerational England are bringing together an intergenerational workforce development task force. It's open to all firms who are interested in engaging more with the topic, and it's been great for bringing together the best of the best when it comes to workplace intergenerational practices. Big welcome, Emily. And last but not least, we have Fintan Canavan. Fintan is an associate director at Protivity, where his focus is on organizational change programs. Fintan's had a 30-year commercial career. He's managed many large multi-generational teams and has a particular interest in the human impact of change. Now, I'm excited to have Fintan here with us today because he really understands how the questions of generations fit with the broader landscape that firms are facing today. And specifically, he brings the insights, the perspectives, and the solutions that firms need to manage the problems as as are being seen by their senior leaders and boards. So a big welcome, Fintan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'll get into our first round of questions. I want to start, Emily, with you, because I think today's topic and the title of today's panel really speaks to your work. Traditionally, when we talk about intergenerational relationships at work, people often think about the youngest and the oldest coming together with these graduates with older mentors or sometimes reverse mentoring. But I'm interested in how we get the majority of employees who fall into these middle generations. How can we get them more involved in intergenerational conversations?
Yes, it's a really important question. And firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. Yeah, I'm really honored to be in this conversation. I think maybe just briefly to kind of frame how at Intergenerational England we look at this intergenerational approach, because it sits across a range of different themes. For us, intergenerational approaches kind of focus on that human to human connection. So building social support systems and networks where we can support well-being and belonging and solidarity across people and places. It also looks at that life course approach. So again, kind of tackling the stigma of it's these two polarizing ends of the spectrum. It's recognizing that each stage of your life course, from being a child to end of life, the nuances of how we live and those relationships that we need to thrive are really important. We really focus on that intersectional perspective. So recognizing that age is fundamental to how we look at society, but also a person is so much more than just their age. So recognizing that, age and race and gender and socioeconomic status are all part of who a person is and how we can support people and build those connections. And fourth, we look at the integrated partnerships. So for us, again, it's around promoting intergenerational relationships, person to person, but also those relationships across sectors and systems. We cannot look at someone solely, for example, where they work, where do they live and where did they go to school and who is there, who do they hang out with at the weekend? It's recognizing a person as their whole self and so really supporting in that system partnership. And I think this question is really important. I mean, this is something that we're really grappling with at Intergenerational England, is that middle generation. We know for the first time in many sectors, we're seeing 5 generations in the workforce. We're demographically changing and it's going to keep evolving in that way. But generally, the kind of makeup of a workforce sits within that Gen X millennials, so that middle age bracket that they make up the majority of the workforce. And with that comes, unique perspectives and challenges. Often, research around this midlife well-being dip. We hear it being called midlife crisis. Well, there's research to back it up, that this is something that across our life course and across that journey, we experience these dips in well-being. And that often comes around early 40s. But this pattern, it's been observed across various countries and cultures. And I think specifically when you look at this, it's important to bring in that intersectional thinking. So for example, around age and gender, and specifically, where this is more pronounced for women, who often have to navigate these pivotal life courses, life stages through their working life, whether that's maternity, caregiving, and then menopause. And even though, we've come on significantly over the past 40 years, and there's been advancements in maternity rights and flexible working. It's acknowledging that this sandwich generation is often experienced, majority by women who are juggling responsibilities, whether that's caregiving for children and for older adults. And what we found is that the social piece of this puzzle is really pivotal in kind of creating space for this kind of cohort group to feel that they're supported throughout that life course. Intergenerational women's projects we found can support in creating that space and bringing together women at different phases, at different stages, to really unpick and offer that support. And for us, around kind of the mentorship that you mentioned, we like to present this idea of mutual mentorship, that, at any stage that you are, you have something of value to contribute, you have a life experience, and the nuances that surround that are really important. And some of the work we've been doing, within workplaces is trying to encourage people to understand their specific generational profile. Because we believe to truly create an intergenerational workplace and it be intentional and positive for the long term, you have to understand who makes up your workforce, and who are they and what are their lives and priorities, and how do they experience work. And even though, the demographic makeup is really important, so recognizing that multi-generational, where they sit within those specific generations, is really important. And alongside that, really understanding, those formative events that have shaped people throughout the life. So, for example, the financial crash of 2008, and now we've got the rise of AI. Well, when people started and entered the workforce, those pivotal social moments have really kind of framed their experiences. But alongside that, recognizing those formative personal events that shape how people experience work. So for us, it's not a one size fits all model, and there's not kind of a one size fits all practice, but having a real understanding of people and their experiences and who they are to be able to support that. And at the heart of it is dialogue and conversation and challenging what we know and what, is very much embedded in our social structures and our workplace structures, and being open to shifting some of that perspective to create, really strong and intentional environments where intergenerational relationships can really thrive. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I know as someone who is in that kind of sandwich generation, I know how important it is to have an intergenerational environment that's essentially going to bring me along for those conversations. You also mentioned there the demographic shift, and we have a aging population, and what that means is that we have now fewer younger people, or less younger talent coming through the pipeline. And I'm really interested in hearing from Alicia as someone who's in touch with the latest graduates. And as a graduate, through the organizations you lead and the content you're producing, I want to know what you see as the key priorities for the current crop of graduates who are entering firms, and also maybe some ways in which you think they might be similar or different to other cohorts that have come before.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me and inviting me to be a part of this special event. It means a lot to me to be here. And I think it is a very important question that you've asked me, because I do feel like those priorities have definitely shifted. And I feel like we've seen that as a result of the pandemic. So I feel like one of the key priorities that the current graduates are looking at now is work-life balance, whereas that was not a conversation that so much importance was placed on with prior generations. And I really think that one of the reasons that is the case is because of the pandemic. Firstly, the pandemic blurred those lines between personal and work life and brought importance and more weight on other factors such as work-life balance. So I feel like the graduates of today are seeking environments where they can thrive professionally, which has been common throughout other graduates and other cohorts, but they're also looking for employers that mean that they can join them without having to sacrifice such key hobbies and interests that they may have in their personal lives. I think one of the clear things is remote working, which we could talk about. I feel like before the pandemic, remote working and flexibility was not really an important conversation because it just wasn't a factor. Whereas COVID brought on those technological advancements, even like today, we're having this event on Zoom, whereas in previous years, this would have been hosted in person and come with all the logistics of holding an in-person event. And now a lot of graduates are asking those questions of how many days do I have to be in the office versus how many days can I work from home and be hybrid? Because all of those questions are very important. It allows you to maybe live outside of London or live on the outskirts of London whilst working in an in London office, because you can work remotely now. And it's definitely changed the landscape of consulting as well. So I feel like now flexibility is not a perk anymore, it's actually a priority. Unlike older generations who may have accepted like longer hours and more rigid employment structures. Another thing that I feel like has come off the back of the pandemic is that more entrepreneurial mindset with Gen Z and that culture of having a side hustle. Like I remember when I was at LSE in my year group, there was one point where it seemed that everybody had a side hustle. Everybody had a passion project alongside their degree. Nobody was only doing the degree anymore. And I do feel like the pandemic sparked that up in our generation, just because I feel like a lot of things became apparent, such as like job insecurity, with things like furlough and so many layoffs. And I still feel like those effects from the pandemic, we're seeing it now. We are definitely in like a post-COVID effect, because a lot of firms have frozen recruitment cycles. Like last year, so many firms, including like Goldman Sachs, just froze hiring cycles, which really shaked things up for a lot of graduates, because it meant that you've got a degree and you just can't seem to get a job because nobody is hiring despite the experience that you may have. And it was really, really difficult for a lot of my friends as well. And another thing we saw was rescinded offers, where interns that had been offered jobs had their offers taken away from them. That happened to quite a lot of my friends that I know of as well. And then another thing we had was delayed start dates, which actually happened to me. My start date was pushed back because there was just no projects that were selling in my firm. So I think all of that insecurity has become so apparent that Gen Z is now looking for other income streams and passive income streams that they can have alongside the 9 to 5. It's no longer a thing where the 9 to 5 is just a viable option. It's now that you need to have a plan B that is a very strong plan B. And like think, for example, a lot of young people started reselling trainers, reselling driving lessons, which is why it's so difficult to get a driving test now. Starting YouTube channels like myself, so many YouTube channels were birthed in the pandemic. Starting podcasts, like there's always ways that our generation are looking to diversify their income streams. So I feel like that has really shifted the priorities that we have, because it's just there's more awareness of the fragility of traditional employment structures. So our generation is looking for employments that support those passion projects and allow and encourage them. And I think a great example is myself as well, because I chose to stick with my firm rather than applying to other firms, because they allowed me to create social media content and they encouraged it. Whereas a lot of other bigger consulting firms would not encourage that and would not allow you to have passion projects alongside the work. So I think those priorities and those questions of does this firm value me have really come into play now.
Fantastic. And I think there's two things there that you mentioned. So you've mentioned this remote working as really being the experience that young people are now expecting and having entering the workforce, as well as the potential side hustles that people are going to be having and nurturing. So given those two things, I'm kind of wondering, well, what is the place for intergenerational relationships for new graduates? Is this something that you're thinking about, or something that you want to be getting out of your 9 to 5 and out of the firm?
I think that's a great question as well. And in my honest opinion, I don't think graduates initially think about those intergenerational relationships and the value of them, because I feel like when you go into a job, you're thinking about upskilling yourself, keeping up with the job, and those hard technical skills that you need, rather than the soft skills such as communicating and networking across generations. But I do think in a sector like mine in consulting, the importance of intergenerational relationships becomes very apparent very quickly. So externally in consulting, your relationships with clients are so incredibly important. And majority, 9 times out of 10, the clients that you will be working with will be from an older generation. And it's important to connect with them, not just on a professional level, presenting data, but it's important to connect with them on a human level and find some sort of common ground that you can share with those clients. Because at the end of the day, those clients are so important to selling your work, to getting them to buy more work with the company. And also in consulting, the main exit route that a lot of young consultants takes is through clients as well. So a lot of the time you'll go and work as an in-house consultant for one of your clients that you've worked on a previous project with. So I feel like the importance of those intergenerational relationships and being able to relate with older generations is extremely important in this industry. And then even internally within the company, rather than just looking at clients, the way that consulting projects works is you'll be staffed on a project with partners, and those partners will be from an older generation. You will actually typically be the youngest person on your project, because they will never staff two consultants on the same project. It's the way it works is you'll have like a consultant, some managers, and some partners on a project. This was something that I experienced in my internship, where I was the youngest person on one of my projects that was staffed with 5 partners, which was quite unusual. Usually it's one partner to a project. And when we had a team dinner, I was quite nervous going into that. And I think the reason I was nervous was just those feelings of like imposter syndrome, like what do I possibly have to bring to this table with 5 partners to discuss, given that they have so much more lived experience than I do. But I think that my biggest tip for young people that are trying to build those intergenerational relationships is just to find some sort of common ground, because you'll be surprised at how much common ground you can find with people despite their different backgrounds or different ages. Like at the end of that team dinner, we got along very well and was just talking about normal things like Love Island and I'm a Celebrity. So I really think those sort of shared lived experiences are really important. And I feel like, yeah, it's very easy to feel intimidated by those barriers between generations and by varying levels of experience. But I do think it's something that is very important. And like Emily was talking about, like the importance of employers recognizing that and setting up mentoring schemes to just break down those generational barriers moving forward.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Alicia. And I think you've ended there with some strong tips for some incoming graduates. I'd like to turn to Fintan and really ask from a company perspective. So what are the key challenges that companies are facing, moving from kind of having this multi-generational representation to creating a more inclusive and intergenerational workforce for all their employees, be it their new talent or existing?
So thanks, Dan, for that, and thanks everybody for having me here. And I was listening quite carefully to what Emily and Alicia said, and the things they talk about are the things that clients talk to us about as well. I think I have a different side because I'm obviously in older generation, and you know my work experience is different, but the things that Alicia and Emily are absolutely true and they resonate. But you know where we see the challenges and the specific challenges that we see about moving from a multi-generational to an intergenerational workforce where there's true collaboration and that. I mean there's several, and they're actually quite obvious. If you think about them, there's a communication gap. I mean that's the biggest thing. Like different generations have different preferences for communication styles and technologies, which can lead to misunderstandings quite easily and inefficiencies. And that's one of the biggest things. One of the more obvious ones is that people don't like change. So there's a resistance to change. So employers sometimes they're resistant to have new policies or practices that aim to promote intergenerational interaction, particularly if they feel that those changes threaten the established way of working or the cultural norms that exist in the organization. There's always the stereotyping and the biases across generations, which can lead to biased thinking and decision making, and that affects everything from hiring practices to day-to-day interactions and how you evaluate performance. I mean, we know from the study from the work studies that you've run, Dan, and the data that we've got from that some of these things did come out quite a lot. I mean, there's a few other ones. I think differing work expectations, and that's the biggest one. I think Alicia nailed it there. And she talked that it's completely different generations have a different expectations regarding work-life balance. That whole career progression, how you work, how you prioritize. You have a life rather than work, and so the balance I think is shifting towards life-work balance rather than a work-life balance, which is what it was, when I started working, and I think that's really, really important. But also the importance of making sure that there's feedback and recognition, which every generation gets, and sometimes if you're not getting that can create some dissatisfaction if it isn't managed properly, and that expectation setting sort of sits along the top of that. Of course, one of the biggest things we see is technology adoption. So technological proficiencies, and that whole thing about AI that that Emily talked about as well, and that like I'm not sure the data bears this out completely fully, but there are different adoption rates across the generations, and it can impact quite significantly the way that when you talk technologies are integrated into the workplace, and it may be challenging for older employees. It might require more training or time to adapt, or they might go, do you know what, I don't want to do that anymore. So there's some potential that can cause some disengagement as well. One of the most important things we find is about knowledge transfer, and Alicia talked about it as well, and Emily a little bit, but that human connection. The thing that I like about the work that we do at Pertivity, in that space, is that we have to recognize we're all human, and we all have different ways that we operate, but that ensuring that there's proper connection allows for that knowledge transfer, between experienced workers and newer employees. But it can be very difficult. But there's no doubt in my mind and in what we've seen that it's quite critical for maintaining organizational knowledge and fostering innovation, to be quite honest, because that experience is very important. I mean, and perspective is very important. And I did see something really interesting last week. We were talking about the single story. And I was with a group of our younger community, facilitating some training, and we talked a little bit about that, and we talked about avoiding the single story, whereas one generation has a perspective, and if that generation is actually almost in charge of meetings or leading the thought process, it's sometimes very hard to get other people to come in and say, well, this is my perspective. So we need to make sure that there's opportunity for that, and I think the research brings that out quite a lot about inclusivity in meetings and allowing perspectives to come through. But it was interesting, it came up last week, as avoiding the single story and avoiding the single perspective was really, really important. I think the last thing that's really important, and I think it's something that we've seen more about in terms of that employer contract, is about, merging different cultural values and work ethics without alienating any group within the organization or any generation within the organization. And that really requires very careful planning. And it needs to be, sensitivity. But, overcoming these things is not, it's not beyond the wit of man. And many organizations are moving towards thinking about how do they get the best value, because there's no doubt in our minds, and again, the research bears out that intergenerational workforces are more productive. There's no doubt, there's no arguments about that. The data, bears that out. But in order to do it, the principal thing I think that organizations need to do is to focus on creating a culture that actually promotes that inclusivity and, fosters open communication, provides education against bias, thinks about flexible working arrangements, which has been a real sea change in the last few years, and I think has changed organizations and how work is performed, beyond recognition, much quicker than I thought it would happen, actually. But the leadership of the organization is the most important thing. It has to role model that sort of inclusive behavior and ensure that the policies and practices, reflect the diverse needs of their workforces. And that's really, really important.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fintan. I think one of the things you mentioned, the technology, and in particular just the discussions that we're having around artificial intelligence across generations. For anyone who missed it off the top, for any of our attendees today, we're doing some research about artificial intelligence and generations. We've got some running now. If you would like to partner with us, it's going to be amazing. Please be on the forefront of this conversation, because it's one that is becoming an increasingly big conversation. You also spoke about the benefits of intergenerational teams really in driving productivity. And I think I'm interested to hear from Emily about some of the research that, Emily, you're conducting with your team at Intergenerational England. I know that you're doing some work at the moment, both your own research as well as collating policies, programs, and some of the best thinking from around the world. I know in particular people here today are going to be interested in the research that you're doing on workforce. I know you've got other streams that focused on housing and health as well. So can you share with our guests today what learnings have emerged so far? What do you see as the key gaps? And do you have any examples of that really illustrate the potential for intergenerational approaches that can help drive that productivity?
Yeah, I mean, research is one of the core pillars of Intergenerational England, and we're very much grounded in learning and developing from effective practice, both nationally and internationally. I think, a lot of the time I will set the premise that this is not a new way of working or living. It's something that we've lost, and it's something that we've lost specifically in our Western way of living, because of advancements in technology, globalization. We are much more segregated by age. We're one of the most age segregated countries in the world. But there are some incredible examples internationally where intergenerational thinking is much more embedded within policy, within strategy development. Around the world, generational differences have been right at the forefront of more so kind of the sociological studies. Augustus Conte noted that it's really pivotal and important to think about intergenerational relationships when we look at evolution of social progress, and really acknowledging and valuing this way of working is the only way that we can advance and progress and address a lot of the challenges that we see. And I think very quickly before I jump into some of the research we're doing, it's really interesting that Fintan and Alicia pulled out some information there around expectation gaps and specific priorities for generations. And I think what we kind of need to stray away from is this siloed way of thinking and working. And yes, it's really important to recognize these generational themes and moments that shape who people are. But actually, what person doesn't want to work 4 days a week or want flexible working hours? If we actually just take it back to that human level, yes, there are much more kind of convicted ideas and ways of working that are coming up, and we're seeing come through this next generation of people because of the life moments that are shaping them. But actually, I think that there's an argument there to kind of strip it back down to that dialogue and building spaces where people can say, well, actually, I've caring for adults and I'm caring for children, and I'd love a flexible 4-day week, similarly. So I just think those little kind of nuances are really important to take away. In terms of some of our broader research, we're looking at that global landscape and recognizing, there's a UN decade of aging that is really kind of grounding a lot of these conversations, and intergenerational recommendations are included within that. What we're finding within a policy making, and whether that's policy at a government level, local council, or indeed within a workplace strategy, is that there are a couple of different approaches to it. So we've got sort of the multi-generational way of looking at it, which is taking that life course approach and creating targeted services according to age-related needs. But it kind of separates the intentional integration of people and systems and priorities. And then we've also got the future generations agenda, which is huge and is being developed around the world, which is really looking at sort of the social and economic systems and structures, but aiming to improve outcomes for young people and future generations. And where we really want to create change and awareness is that intergenerational piece. So the intentional closing of gaps and tackling those challenges between generations in a really connected and integrated way. There is a lot of research in this area, and incredible research done by LSE and the generations work that you're doing with Fintan as well. And a lot of that has kind of, led some of our thinking. But I think, again, there's kind of that separation between, academic research and that shift into, practical adoption of that, and really recognizing the need for that. And similarly, Fintan mentioned it there, but it's a culture shift, and it's a knowledge gap within a workplace. And I think we're finding that, it's that top down, bottom up, middle out. Everyone has to understand the benefit of this. Everyone has to kind of invest in the role that they play within this. And for us, that leadership training and that leadership knowledge of you know, how this can support recruitment, retention, productivity, innovation within a workspace, and really building the economic and social case for this, because I think it's really important for the two to sit side by side. And I think just to kind of, for us at Intergenerational England, as Daniel said, we're creating this workforce task force. The name needs a bit of work, but and the idea is, you know, to encourage organisations that really have an energy and commitment to understanding age diversity and understanding the role of intergenerational kind of power and approach within the workplace. You know, it's not something we can escape. It's these demographic changes are as common as climate change. So we need to place that same urgency on finding really positive and sustainable solutions. And for us, it is about action and driving change through solution based. So we have a 12-month development phase where we're creating a playbook and bringing together case studies from organisations across sectors across the world, underpinned by research like the research LSE have done, and then some clear recommendations and tangible actions that we hope will support in embedding some of this thinking within an organisational structure, but also influencing kind of local and national government agendas to you know, take this seriously and to really start thinking about it in the context of policy making, strategic development, community development. So yeah, there's a lot of work, and for us it's all rooted in collaboration and pooling together learning and research that's been done, but trying to make change through action.
Terrific. Thank you, Emily. You've spoken there at a policy level and at an organizational level. And I think one of the things that you said there is that, you know, we've kind of lost these intergenerational connections in our society. And I think I'm keen to bring it back to each and every one of us through Alicia. You know, you're doing this work now where you're almost, it seems to me, trying to build some of that intergenerational bridge. You have a podcast, it's called To My Younger Self, which is almost this opportunity to impart some of this wisdom to the next generation that's coming through, inspiring students, graduates, they're one. But I'm interested, you're currently a somewhat younger self, you're one day going to be an older self. And so I'm interested, your podcast imparts these ideas to the younger generation, but I'm interested in what words of wisdom you might want to share from a career or other perspective with your older self, whether that be corporate or otherwise from where you are today.
I think that's a great question. Thank you very much. And I think, as you've highlighted, majority, if not all of the work that I do online is around social mobility and focuses on working with the younger generations. But as you've mentioned, the podcast is a very intergenerational space, because what we do is we bring on the leaders of today to connect with the leaders of tomorrow. That's essentially our whole vision, is bringing on CEOs, people that are much later on in their career, and having an honest, raw conversation with them that younger people can tune in and listen to hear those key gems that can be imparted from different generations. And so a lot of the time, because I'm working so much with younger generations and social mobility, I'm not actually looking ahead, like you said, and like thinking about advising my older self. So I thought this question was very interesting, just to pause and have a little think about that. And it's actually something that I did this year, and an activity that I'd recommend a lot of people to do is I wrote a letter to my future self on New Year's Day. So in that letter, a lot of what I spoke about is just reminding myself about how strong I am, because I think it's so easy to forget that. So for more context, last year I had a major operation towards the end of the year, and it really tested me in terms of like my physical and mental limits. And in my letter to my future self, it was mainly just reminding myself of all of those things that I've overcome in life to get to where I am. And I think, speaking to my older self, that's just something that I'd want to remind myself, is just those sacrifices, those struggles, and how hard I've worked, how hard my younger self has worked to get here. Because I do think it's very easy to lose that. It's very easy to lose your roots and to forget those sacrifices that you've made to get to your current position. And I think it's important not to forget that, not to forget my background, my roots, where I've come from. Because when you start to forget that and you lose that part of yourself, you're losing connection to your true, authentic self. And I think in the corporate space, it's very easy to lose that part of yourself, because and I feel like this is a conversation that needs to be had more as well, that not many people speak about, but it can be very difficult moving from a lower class, working class background where you might have been the first in your family to attend university, to then moving into these powerful corporate spaces where you're amongst like a new middle class lifestyle, and you're adapting to all these unfamiliar cultural norms. Your interests and your preferences change. Like a few years ago, I never thought I would be interested in going on something like a ski trip. Like that's just something that wasn't on the table for me. But now it's like my interests and preferences have developed as I've changed and have accessed this new career and trajectory for my life. And in some way, that is great. And obviously, it's very normal that your interests and preferences will change as your income changes and your environment changes. But it's also important to, like I said, not forget your roots, not forget where you've come from, and to stay connected with your community that raised you, essentially. And so that's something that I just want to carry on through my career, is just to continue mentoring, to continue connecting to my previous community, and to just not lose myself. And I do feel like it is something that is universally experienced, but just needs to be spoke about more. Because I was even having a conversation with my friend about this, who's a consultant at Kiani, and she said that a survey went around, and most of the employees said that they feel like they are too posh when they return back home after a long day at work. And I think that's the case because there's this thing of like, you have to code switch and you have to change who you are, and you can't bring your full authentic self to work. And obviously, whilst it's important to adapt to professional environments, to like understand the corporate jargon and to fit in to an extent, it's also important to not lose yourself and to just remember who you are. So I would just, like, speaking to my older self, I would just remind her to just be proud of both worlds, to be proud of where you've come from, where you are today, and to just not lose that and to not let it overshadow who you actually are.
Thank you, Alicia. I really like that, particularly, in the UK where there's a big focus on, how we achieve greater socioeconomic equality. I think that that's a tension that's not always spoken about, that, this idea of, well, that I've heard the term class traitor before by essentially leveling up or wanting to improve your life and having difficulty when you go back in trying to be, as you said, trying to code switch or to reconcile where you've come from. So I think that's lovely advice. And in that spirit, I'd like to invite maybe Fintan first, if you want to share some advice with your younger self as to what you would like to pass on, and maybe even how we can promote more intergenerational workforces.
Yeah, so I mean, it was very interesting what Alicia said at the end, about being authentic and showing your own self and the language and that, because I'm sure you'll all recognize that I'm from I'm from Ireland, I'm from the west of Ireland, so that sensitivity I had when I came to work in London, in the city after university, was very high. It was very high amongst myself and my peer group, that we were very conscious of the fact that we spoke differently and we probably had a different perspective and we didn't quite fit in with some of our peers. So that adaptation was quite hard, and we did mask, I think, ourselves quite considerably at the beginning of our careers. And I think, Alicia, your generation particularly, and probably it's true of Emily's as well, is that you're less inclined to do that. You have to sort of play the game a little bit, but that authenticity is really, really quite important, I think, to allow, or to bring that, to move that to the intergenerational. So the advice, that I think I would be giving myself was, is I think probably to be more culturally aware. I think I was, and to be more sensitive about different people and where they come from and how they are and what they might value. Be very open to having advice, and I think mentorship and finding mentors, and that's really, really important. Somebody that you trust, somebody you respect, because that allows different understandings to happen outside in a safe space, and understanding the dynamics of work and all that. I think that was one of the things that was really, really important for me, was And it probably, I think in my generation took longer to understand what is work like, and what are the dynamics, and what is the, what can we reasonably expect from leadership, and how can we then behave, and how can we role model where we should be, and all those kind of things. I think they're really, really important. I think taking advantage of all the training and any training that you can get, any training and development, particularly if there's training that in nowadays that focus on bringing people from across an organization so that you can hear and see different generations interact. And I think that's really, really important. I think the flexible work practices, as I said already, I think they're critical in terms of, moving to that kind of moving to that intergenerational workforce. But I think that's something that I think has only really started to play in recent years, to be quite honest. I mean, there was some discussion about flexible work, possibly earlier in my career, in my commercial career, but flexible, it was very, very limited in terms of flexible, to be quite honest. And I think most of the people who had some flexibility were, they were made to feel it, and they were almost held to a higher bar as a result, which was quite tricky and difficult for them, actually, and I think unreasonable. I think one of the most important things, though, is for organizations, if we can in some way encourage organizations to continue to have inclusive policies and practice, and to recognize that people are different, because we're all different. And I think what is true in all the organizations I worked in, and the organizations I work with now in the last 7 or 8 years particularly, is that human dynamics is at the root of everything. And in the workplace, it becomes even more profound. So you need to understand what drives other people, and you need to understand, and you need to try and understand a little bit better about what people's motivations are, and where their drivers are, and where they are in their lives, and what their priorities might be, because that changes all the time. And just being more open to that, and more sensitive to that fact that as a community, and as a collaborative community, you're much stronger together. People add different amounts at different times, because we're all different. But I think that kind of inclusivity is the only way that we're going to make our workplaces work effectively in the coming years, because we're all living longer. We all like to work longer. I certainly will want to work probably a little bit longer than my state retirement, because work is good, and work is very important for people's mental health more than anything else. And I think that's something that we don't talk about either, that work gives people purpose, as well as it gives them reward to do the things that they like. I think there's some change in terms of how we address work, and make it a life-work balance rather than the other way around, as I've said already. But I think Alicia's generation and Emily's generation will really drive some of those conversations. And if we have enough role models in the workplace, which show those behaviors and drive it, that will become the norm. And I think that's what we just need to keep encouraging.
A big thank you, Hinton. And Emily, I'd like to turn to
Yes,
you.
I mean, they covered a lot there. I'll keep it really short, because just 2 kind of main points. I think for me, actually part of the Gen Z generation, which is an interesting one, because where you identify and who you feel that you are within those boxes is complex and multifaceted. But I think for me, that sort of challenging of both the internal and external ageism that we see is really important. So being an advocate for appropriate language and fair policies, but also challenging. I sit around boards all the time and think, God, imposter syndrome. I think a bit like Alicia of, I don't know enough, or I haven't got the right things to say, and actually there's value in what we all have to contribute, and it's really important to, give yourself space, and also be the advocate to create space for others. So I would say that. And I think that my second point very quickly is to think about this beyond the workplace, that actually this intergenerational way of living, it is way beyond just where you are 9 to 5. And actually looking at it within a context of housing and health and social connectivity and community development is really important, and recognizing that we're all part of the solution, and we're all drivers of this change. You know, whether you're the next leader of tomorrow or you're a leader today, you know, you have a role to play in shaping what happens next.
Lovely. Thank you, Emily. A big thank you to the panel. I want to turn to some of our audience questions. We've got a number of them there. One of the themes I think has come out from today has been the change that we've experienced in recent years around flexible working. One of the first questions that we've got, it comes from Martina. Thank you, Martina. And Martina has raised the essentially how we've had some flexibility in the past 20 years. It became very prominent during COVID. And now the question is, does it feel like there's a U-turn? And if so, what are the reasons behind? And I think we've seen some of these back to the office mandates. What's going on? Are we seeing a bit of a reversal of where we've gotten to with flexibility? I'm open to anyone in the panel. Alicia, I'd be keen to hear your perspective on this, given that this is something a lot of graduates are coming to expect.
Yeah, I do think there's a bit of a U-turn. I think firms are trying to find the balance between having a hybrid model versus having people in the office, because there is so much value that comes from having your team in person versus virtually. And so they're trying to strike that balance of kind of pleasing workers and satisfying those like work-life balance demands versus actually having a productive workspace. I wouldn't say it's a complete U-turn. I just think they're trying to find that balance. Because, for example, a few consulting firms that I know of are now not expensing like work from home equipment because they want you to be in the office more. So it's like subtle measures that they're doing to try and get people in the office more without having a hard line and saying you need to be back in the office 5 days a week. Because I do feel like if firms started saying you need to be back here 5 days a week, there would just be a lot of movement. Because there's been a survey as well, for example, I think 2/3 of Gen Z have said that they're not loyal to a company, that they have no problem moving, and that they're actually applying for other jobs whilst they're at the current firm. Whereas with previous generations, that loyalty was more apparent to a particular firm. So if firms start demanding workers to come in 5 days a week, you would just see a lot of movement and a lot of employees leaving the workforce. So I think it's about trying to strike that balance.
Terrific. I really like that idea of how organizations strike the balance. Emily, a question for you. One of the ones that's come through is around the needs and wishes across people of different generations and how they might overlap. But one of the questions is that there are sometimes age-specific needs. The example in the chat is women going through menopause. And really the question is, do you have best practices for sharing or generating awareness or understanding in organizations? How can we support each other with respect to age-specific needs?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, it's a really important question. And it's one where the intergenerational mechanism really can show itself. Obviously specific to sort of the women's life course journey and the conversation around menopause at the moment, that there are changes happening within a workplace and I think more socially in how we look at menopause. But I think where the intergenerational could be so powerful is, for example, Alicia and myself one day will be in that position. And I think, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of stigma surrounding menopause, what it looks like in terms of your career, what it looks like in terms of your social well-being, in terms of your kind of health. And again, it comes back to sort of that open dialogue and building of relationships to be able to share those life experiences and create an understanding that is driven by a workplace culture, if that makes sense. So having dedicated space where women can come together across generations and actually be part of that conversation and challenge stereotypes and fears and hear from people that are going through it, I think is a step in the right direction, where a company and a workplace can be showing that they place value on that journey that a woman goes through, and that's inevitable for all of us. Very similar to maternity leave and caring for children and all of those stages. And it's that intersection piece again, which is so paramount to understanding the intergenerational approach.
Yeah, and I'd also like to say that I've walked into a number of rooms and I've seen the menopause conversation shut down as I've walked into the room, and I've often kind of challenged it and said, well, how come? Or, and so I think there's also a thing for men, to what extent we can engage in those conversations, and to what extent we're wanted, and or maybe should or shouldn't be in the room in order to support, but whilst also providing the space for people's experience to be heard in differently. So I think it's
I think that's a really good point. It's not all down to us women, is it? It's got to be a collaborative effort.
Yeah, terrific. So I think we have time for just one more question. I'd like to direct it to Fintan. You mentioned that culture change is difficult. Teresa has asked a question that sometimes when we talk about generations, we're often talking about seniority.
Yeah.
And this is something I know that we've spoken about a lot, and we've about in our research. So do you have any insights for our audience about how these two concepts, seniority and generations, how do they interact, and how can we approach it for successful culture change? I think the flexible working is a good example of some of that we've just discussed.
There's a couple of things, and we've done a little bit of work around this, and one of the there's a few things actually. So one of the things is that leadership has to be open to actually understanding their culture. One of the things that we feel we need to say, we always need to say, well, what does your culture look and feel like today? So we need to kind of understand that. And the way to do that is to get some input across all of the organization, which is, we've done a recent piece of work where we did that, and it was quite insightful to the leadership. The critical thing was that the CEO was open, and there was enough balance within his team that they were open to hearing what people had to say. The way that we suggested, there's a number of things we suggested in terms of moving it and actually understanding it a little bit better. Not through the usual survey nonsense, but actually using the employee network groups almost as a way to gather information and as to how people are and how people work and how they think. And what we said about the employee network groups, it was very important to have intergenerational groups or multi-generational members of those groups to allow intergenerational collaboration to happen. So all of the employee network groups, and then this particular organization had a D&I sort of committee, if you like. But it was almost like a sop to actually, we need one of these because it's the right thing to do. But actually we said, well, actually you can make this, this can be your guide almost as an executive group to say, well, how are people thinking and what are the things that we would like to change? So fostering that, allowing, first of all, that the executive are open to that and recognizing that, where there are cultural differences that need to change, and then allowing voices to be heard across the network groups, because typically the network groups are multi-generational, and that people have particular passions around certain things. But actually that conversation, when those conversations happen as a whole and then they get fed back into the organization, the executive are getting all of this information for free, and it's more open. People are they're more willing to be I think to be more open about what they want and what they need and how they feel about the organization. Because the critical thing, as we all know, is that workforces have to change. They have to adjust to culture as it evolves, because every single organization is going to have a crunch time in terms of their resourcing. There's a big issue happening where lots of our generations are, there'll be big generations leaving the workforce, but there's this competition for resource, and Alicia kind of touched on it a little bit, at the top end when they're talking about, the fact that some of there was a pause in some of the big firms hiring, but they're all back in the game. And there's a competition for resources, and it's resources not just you know, highly technical, qualified, top university sort of resources. It's for all types of resources at every stage, in every organization, with every skill set, because our workforce in the UK is aging.
Yeah, I think the certainly the aging demographic that we have, I think, is often a conversation as well as what executives and generations get, as well as this conversation about aging workforce and generations. These are ones that often get combined. As we come to the end of our panel today, I'd like to give a final big thank you to our guests, Alicia, Emily, and Fintan. In the chat, you will see
Pleasure.
the opportunity to link with all of them. Please do. I'd like to give one final pitch to please come and participate in the Generations work that we're doing, Generations Hub. We have an amazing new project which we're doing, which is research on AI across the generations. As Fintan raised, we think this is a big topic of conversation. We'd invite all of you to get involved and to share. And also please reach out to our panelists and follow the amazing work that they're doing and connect on LinkedIn. Once again, I'd like to say a big thank you to our audience, to our panel. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. I look forward to our next conversation about generations. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Very much.